Hafa and welcome to the University of Guam's Cycad Walk. My name is Benjamin Deloso. I'm a research associate here at the University of Guam. And today we're going to take a look at cycads, an ancient plant group. Here at the Cycad Walk we have all 10 known genera of cycads represented. This Cycad Walk was the brainchild of Dr. Thomas Marler, a now retired professor at the university. So the first genus of cycad that I'm going to introduce to you is the genus Cycas, which this plant to my right is a member of. DNA evidence suggests that this genus is older than the other 9 genera that I'm going to introduce to you, meaning that it evolved at an earlier point in geologic time than the other cycads. So it's the most ancient or primitive among the living cycads. There are over 100 species in the world that are distributed mainly around Asia and Australia. And the Guam cycad, known as the fadeng, which I'll talk about later, is a member of this genus. The second genus is Macrozamia, which in Latin means big Zamia. So it's just a larger version of Zamia. This genus is restricted to the Australian continent with about 30 some odd species. Macrozamia is more palm-like than any of the other cycads, according to some experts. The plant here is Macrozamia morii, and the leaflets are very sharp. The next genus is called Lepidozamia, which means scaly Zamia in Latin. This genus is also restricted only to Australia, and there are only 2 species known. This particular species is Lepidozamia hoppii, and it is one of the tallest growing cycads in the world. And specimens of this plant have been known to live over 1,000 years old. This species is popular with garden collectors because it has no spines, no armaments on the leaves. And this species may not be a good garden plant for Guam, as our original plant was killed by the last typhoon. The next genus is called Bowenia, and it is another group that is only found in Australia, containing only 2 species. The stem of Bowenia is entirely subterranean, meaning that it does not form a trunk like a typical cycad, and it is an example of how some cycads remain small at maturity. The plant here is Bowenia cerulata, which refers to the fact that there are serrations on the leaves. And I want to take this time to shout out to Frankie Mantanani for keeping up with the garden maintenance over the last few years. The next genus of cycad is Encephalartos, which is found only on the African continent. The name Encephalartos means bread in the head because for generations, many native African tribes would grind the stems of these plants up and make them into a flour. The species that we see here is Encephalartos turneri, native to Mozambique. Some of the greatest threats to this genus of cycad include harvesting of plants for traditional medicine and illegal poaching for the horticulture trade. The next genus is Stangeria, which is also only found on the African continent, and it contains only 1 species, Stangeria eriopus. The velvety hairs that cover this cycad when the leaves are emerging make the plant unique. And like the Bowenia, this plant is entirely subterranean, meaning it doesn't form a trunk like other cycads. The stems of Stangeria are used for traditional medicine, which is one of the threats that is currently affecting the species. The next genus is Ceratozamia, which in Latin means horned Zamia, referring to the horn-like projections on the reproductive structures. This genus is primarily restricted to Mexico with about 30 some odd species recognized. The leaves can be quite large, reaching up to 3 meters in length in comparison to the stem. This plant is Ceratozamia latifolia, and it has produced a reproductive structure. Cycads are not flowering plants, so they reproduce by cones, much like pine trees. So we'll take a look at what that looks like. Here's an example of a cone. Cycads are dioecious, meaning that the sexes are on separate plants. So this Ceratozamia is a male, and this old male cone's primary function is to release pollen grains, which in nature would be transported to the female plant. The next genus is called Dioon, which refers to how the seeds are always born in pairs. There are 16 some odd species that are found almost entirely in Mexico, with the exception of one species which is found in Honduras. The plant to my right is Dioon spinulosum, and it grows on limestone cliffs and rocky hillsides in Mexico. The species name spinulosum refers to how the leaflets are armed with spines, so don't want to get too close. The two phylla rows in the front of the garden are also in the genus Dioon. It's a different species, Dioon edule, which was the first species to be described. The next genus is Microcycas, which in Latin means little cycas, and it's from western Cuba and nowhere else in the world, and there's only one species, Microcycas calicoma. The name Microcycas is a little misleading because this species is one of the tallest growing cycads in the world. It's an example of how a plant can be safe in cultivation through horticultural means, but critically endangered in the wild. The last genus of cycad is Zamia, which is perhaps the most difficult genus of cycad to describe in terms of ecology and morphology. There are more than 70 accepted species in the genus. This plant is a male. It is a Zamia vasquezii, a species found in Mexico that is endangered due to habitat loss. This is a male plant, which the pollen cones that you see here, they are spent, and their main purpose is to release pollen that is transported in nature to the female plant. Conservation sometimes involves the rescuing of plants. The plant to my left is a female of Guam's native Cycas micronesica. This plant was destined to be killed by military construction activities. Researchers at the University of Guam rescued this plant and are now maintaining it and its records here at the Cycad Walk. This form of conservation is called salvage and is an important approach to saving the genetic diversity of native plants. Cycas micronesica additionally is the only native gymnosperm in the Mariana Islands, meaning that it is the only plant that produces seeds but not flowers. The Chamorro name for this native species is fadang, and the seeds of this species were traditionally used for food during times of famine by the Chamorro peoples. So this is a female version of our native cycad, fadang. So in Cycas, the female reproductive structures are born on these stalks that are called megasporophylls, that is the sporophyll-bearing leaves. These are the seeds that were traditionally harvested by Chamorro peoples during times of famine and ground into a flour. The entire structure is called a megastrobolus, but in the case of Cycas, it is not enclosed in a compact cone. The sporophylls dangle freely and the seeds are exposed to the open environment. Plant exploration by botanists is critical for discovering species that are new to science. The three plants to my right are Cycas lindstromii, which are named after University of Guam collaborator Anders Lindstrom, after the plants were discovered in Vietnam. Here we see a male cone, so this is typical of male cycads where the male cone contains pollen. The University of Guam has been heavily involved in exploration in the Philippines and elsewhere in search of cycad populations that are unique. Several populations have been discovered that are unique and have not yet been given a scientific name. These endeavors are important because conservation of a species can only occur after the species has been described and named by the scientific community. So here is an example of a male cone of Cycas. As typical among cycads, the male cone contains pollen, and you see here if I tap it, pollen is released from the cone. In nature, insects would come and visit the cone, and this is a very complex relationship. When two species that are closely related but are geographically separated are used to produce a seed by botanists, this phenomenon is known as interspecific hybridization. The cycad here is an interspecific hybrid between Cycas thouarsii from Madagascar and Cycas platyphylla from Australia. The result is a plant that is similar in appearance to the Guam cycad but has a tinge of blue in the leaves. This makes for an interesting horticultural specimen in the landscape. These three plants around me look slightly different, but they are in fact all the same species, Zamia integrifolia. It is the only cycad native to the continental United States, and the variation in the leaf shapes and sizes is a result from isolated populations throughout its natural range. Gardeners can use this natural variation to add variety to their gardens. To my right is Cycas revoluta, the most commonly cultivated cycad in the world, although it is only found naturally in southern Japan. This plant to my right is the other most commonly cultivated cycad in the world, commonly known as the cardboard palm, Zamia furfuracea, and you can find it in gardens around the world. That concludes our tour of the Cycad Walk today. Thank you all for watching, and we hope to see you here at the University of Guam at some point in the future.